This is Unit 3, Part 3. We're now going to talk about the peripheral nervous system. We spoke previously about the central nervous system, which is made up of the brain and the spinal cord, and now outside of that you have the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is made up of all the nerves and ganglia that lie outside of the brain and the spinal cord. So that would include cranial nerves that emerge out of the brain, spinal nerves associated with the spinal cord, and all the other peripheral nerves that are out there, which we won't get into in this description, but I have described them to a certain extent last semester to you. I should point out that this diagram, which shows nerves, is only a partial representation of the very intricate nerve pathways that are present in the body. So it's just to give you an idea. But there are, in fact, there is much more nervous tissue than shown here. Okay, the cranial nerves, there are 12 pairs of them coming associated with the brain. They're numbered according to using Roman numerals from 1 through 12, and each of them, in addition, also has a name. And we'll cover some of those in detail, some of them in detail, not all. The spinal nerves, for the spinal nerves that are coming in and out of the spinal cord, there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves, and they are named according to the level of the spine from which they emerge. So you have the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and also coccygeal, which isn't shown. In terms of the cranial nerves, they emerge out of the brain from above the first vertebra. Anywhere above the first vertebra, that's a cranial nerve. They could provide, depending on which nerve you're talking about, either one-way or two-way communications. I remind you that sensory information is one-way, is coming into the brain, and motor information is going out after the input is being processed, and if required, then you can have motor output. So that would be two-way communication. So for the cranial nerves, some have either sensory only going into the brain or motor only function. They're associated with motor function or sensory function. These are one way, and some of them have both sensory and motor function. These types of cranial nerves are called mixed nerves. There are among the nerves that can do motor output, there are 4 of them that can carry parasympathetic fibers which serve involuntary muscles and glands. So here you see a blown up diagram of the cranial nerves, not all of the cranial nerves, but the points at which they are emerging or going into the brain itself. Remember, I told you the brain stem is associated with 10 out of the 12. The ones that I would particularly pay attention to are cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 2, the optic nerve, and also I'll talk about cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. Well, let's go to the next slide. I think it's better. Okay, so as I mentioned, some nerves have only sensory and some have only motor. So they only have incoming sensory fibers going into the brain, or they only have outgoing motor fibers, or they sometimes are mixed nerves and they have both incoming and outgoing nerve fibers. An example of a cranial nerve that only has sensory input would be the olfactory nerve or the optic nerve 1 and 2 are both sensory only. You only have sensory information coming in terms of smell or vision. You don't have any motor output through your nose or nasal mucosa. You don't have any motor output through your eyes. There are examples here of some that are motor function only, although we won't get into that detail. And then there's the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10, which has both sensory input and motor output. It also happens to carry some parasympathetic fibers and is the only one of the cranial nerves that projects down into the body below the head and neck. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the cranial nerve 1, which is the olfactory nerve. It arises at the olfactory epithelium that you have in your nasal cavity. You have sensory neurons there that can respond to smells, which in fact the response is due to molecules getting solubilized into the mucus and then interacting with sensory nerve fiber endings that can respond to those kind of chemicals. And it sends nerve fibers running back through the olfactory bulb and into the primary olfactory cortex, the cerebral cortex that's involved in processing olfactory information. It functions strictly by carrying in afferent sensory impulses. There is no motor output. And here you see, in this area here, a blow up of that area, and you'll see the olfactory bulb, which is at the end here, and then the olfactory tract projecting back in towards the brain. And that is shown right here. I'll do it in a different color, right in this area. There's an olfactory bulb there, there's another one there, and there's the olfactory tract projecting back into the brain. So that's how you sense smells and send that information into your cerebral cortex. The cranial nerve 2 is the optic nerve. And when I say nerve, it's always nerves, because they're in pairs, right? So you have two cranial nerves. You have two cranial nerve 2s, and therefore two optic nerves that project back. They arise from specialized sensory neurons that respond to light, which are present in the retina of the eye. These pass back, they project back through optic canals, and they converge on each other at the optic chiasma, or the optic chiasm. And then they continue onwards to the thalamus, where they synapse with other neurons, and from there they run back into the visual cortex, which I would remind you is found in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain, at the back of the cerebrum. These function also, just like cranial nerve 1, they function by carrying just sensory information or sensory impulses back that are coming from those photoreceptors in your eye. So here you see here they're showing actually the eyes, the position of the eyes. So the sensory neurons are in the retina at the back of the eye, along the back here. Let me do it here like this, there. So you have sensory neurons in that area in the back of the eye, and the optic nerve 2 moves along optic tracts back, and it's not chiasm, it's chiasma. Okay, so they cross over at the optic chiasma. That's what it means by they converge. They come together here, and some of the axons cross over. Some go from this eye, for example, some will cross over and others will go onto the ipsilateral or same side. Same thing here on this side here. Some come down and then go over this way, and others cross over. So you have information going from both sides, from each of the to both sides from each of the eyes. So the information is picked up, sent back, and the fibers cross over at the optic chiasma, which can easily be seen underneath the brain, and you'll see it on the models, but on a brain specimen you can also see that very characteristic fairly large X where the two cross over each other. And they go back into the thalamus, where so all the information is going into the thalamus. It's this particular nucleus in the thalamus. I wouldn't worry about it, but it goes into the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is all in this area there. And then it's sent back, or they make synapses there, and then they get sent back into the occipital lobe, where the visual cortex is located, and that's where the information is processed. So that's cranial nerve 2. The other cranial nerve that I wanted you to particularly know about is cranial nerve 10. This is the vagus nerve. It's the only one, as I said, that extends beyond or below the head and neck. It's a mixed nerve. It carries both sensory afferent information inwards to the brain and efferent motor impulses out of the brain. Most of those not all of the motor output are parasympathetic fibers, and they're going to organs like the lung and the heart and other organs, visceral organs. It does have a sensory function also, an incoming information, and that's for taste, from taste sensory neurons in your tongue and your mouth. And here's a diagram that shows the vagus nerve 10, the vagus nerve, which is cranial nerve 10, emerging out of the brain stem in this case of the brain, and projecting downwards to most of the visceral organs in the body. Okay, now let's talk about the spinal nerves. So as I said before, you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves that emerge out of the spinal cord in between the bones and the vertebra, which allow for two-way communication into and out of the spinal cord. If it's two-way, then obviously it's sensory in and motor out, and so they are obviously all mixed nerves with sensory in and motor output. And of course, all information that goes into the spine will also be sent up to the brain. And I'll show you the different nomenclature on the next slide, I believe. Yeah. So 31 pairs of nerves. They're attached by what are called roots, and I'll describe that in more detail later. The cervical and lumbar areas, remember, the nerves are named according to the level along the spinal column. So cervical nerves come out of the cervical area of the spinal column. So you have 8 cervical spinal nerves, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral. It's not sacrum, it's sacral here. Sacral nerves, you see. And 1 coccygeal. So that's 20, 25, 30, 31. 31 pairs of nerves. 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar, sacral, and coccygeal. So if we look at a cross-section through the spinal cord, what you find here is that you have, and I want to point out to you that this is the dorsal side, so that's the back of the person, and this is the ventral side, so the anterior front of the person. You know, along your spine in the back, when you feel those projections of the spinal column, the bones, you're feeling these bones here projecting out of your back. Okay, so that's the dorsal side. You have the spinal cord right in the center here, and it has a very characteristic shape to the tissues. What you have in the spinal cord are is gray matter, and it's present in this kind of butterfly shape right in the spinal cord, and it's surrounded by white matter. On the dorsal side, you have incoming nerve tracts or axons, which come in on the dorsal side, and they are associated with an enlargement right here, and that enlargement is found on both. This is found on both sides, which is called the dorsal root ganglion. This is where the sensory neurons have their cell bodies, but the axons themselves are projecting. They're coming in this way, the sensory nerves coming in that way, and there's the dorsal root ganglion in this area here, and then they're projecting inwards into the spinal cord into this area here. So they're coming in on the dorsal side. This area, and I'll show it, I believe, on the next slide. This area on the dorsal side here in this area here, that's the dorsal root. So the dorsal root is this. There's the dorsal root ganglion, an enlargement where the cell bodies are found for the sensory nerves. So all of that is carrying sensory information into the spinal cord. This is just one, showing one section through the spinal cord. So you have one pair of spinal nerves at this level. Okay, so that's the incoming sensory information. In terms of outgoing motor impulses, what you have is a ventral root, and that's here. That's not very good. Just a second. That's found right here. This is the ventral root, and it goes down. There's no enlargement. The cell bodies of the motor neurons that send out these long axons out from the spinal cord, all the cell bodies are found right in here in this area here. Okay, so we have they're coming out of the ventral root. So all of this, in fact, here is here is the ventral root coming out. Ventral root here, it's a little bit lower, coming out, and the dorsal root carrying the sensory information in is found here. Okay. So here's another diagram showing that same idea, slightly different viewpoint, and it's showing 3 pairs of spinal nerves that are coming in. The arrangement is the same for any of the spinal nerves, so we can just look at this and apply that to the others. You have that central area in the spinal cord, which is butterfly shaped, right there. You have, this is the, this is the gray matter. That butterfly shaped area is the gray matter. Gray matter. You have the dorsal root, bringing in sensory information there. Let me just clear that up. There's the dorsal root. That's where the sensory information is coming in. It comes out of the rest of the body, sending information in, and the cell bodies are found there in the dorsal root ganglion. This part here, right at the tip of the gray matter here, right there and there, that is called the dorsal horn. Right? Not the posterior horn usually, but the dorsal horn. So right there at that point, that's the dorsal horn. Here, this is the dorsal root. Okay, coming into the dorsal horn of the gray matter in the spinal cord. Similarly, we have motor neurons. Their cell bodies are not found in dorsal root ganglion, but they're found right inside the gray matter. So you have cell bodies for the motor neurons. They're located in these areas here. And you have a you have a ventral horn, which contains those cell bodies. So the ventral horn in this area here. Okay, that area there, that's the ventral horn, and the axon projections go out through the ventral root and then out towards the rest of the body. Same thing on the other side. There's the ventral horn, the ventral root, and the motor output going out to different kinds of tissues. So sensory information, just to repeat it all, like an overview, sensory information is coming in towards the spinal cord from other areas of the body, and it is traveling along axons of sensory neurons, and it's being brought in along these tracts right in there into the spinal cord. The sensory information is traveling along the sensory nerve that heads in towards the spinal cord. The sensory neuron nuclei, the soma, or the cell bodies, are present in here in this dorsal root ganglion. The axons are coming in and the cell bodies are there, and then you have projecting further along this area here, along the dorsal root, and entering in at the dorsal horn. So information is coming in like this. Okay, along the dorsal root, dorsal nerve, sensory nerve, through the area of the dorsal root ganglion where you have cell bodies, in through the dorsal root to the dorsal horn. And then if you can get processing actually at the level of the spinal cord, or it may go up to the brain, but for motor output, the motor neuron cell bodies are found here in the ventral area in the ventral horn and pass out through the ventral root, through motor nerves that go outwards there and there. So that's the setup for the spinal cord. Ventral part are motor roots, motor nerves, and the dorsal part are sensory roots or sensory nerves with sensory ganglia, the dorsal root ganglia. Together, by the way, they do, by the way, come out and then fuse together into one bundle of nerves, mixed nerves. So it's coming out separate, the dorsal and the ventral parts, but then they fuse into one nerve to form a spinal nerve. Okay. The gray matter itself, that butterfly-shaped area in the spinal cord, consists of cell bodies, or soma. Soma is the word for cell bodies of neurons. There are some nerves, axons, that are non-myelated. There's some other cells. I wouldn't worry too much about that. I don't think we'll get into all this detail. Basically, what we've covered here is gray matter includes the dorsal horn, which has sensory input, ventral horn, which has motor output. We have, of course, the central canal in the middle, which has cerebral spinal fluid in it. Remember, there is a space with cerebral spinal fluid all the way down, connecting up into the brain, into the fourth ventricle and the third ventricle, etc. And it is covered, just like the brain itself, it is covered with connective tissue membranes. On the outside, going from the outside in, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. And here on this side we have the dorsal root ganglion is shown, the dorsal root and the ventral root. Okay. And here is a diagram that shows organization of the gray matter in the spinal cord in terms of which areas are responsible for what kind of functions. So remember, for sensory information, that's the dorsal root there. There's the dorsal root, and you can see a diagram of 2 out of many thousands of cell bodies. The nuclei of cell bodies are represented here in this area, just 2, just to give you a clear idea. So you have sensory information coming in. Now there's 2 types of sensory information. There's somatic sensory information, which is coming from the skin and the muscles and the joints. And then there's visceral sensory information. So you have somatic sensory neurons carrying information along the dorsal root into the dorsal horn. Here it's called the posterior horn, but a better term is the dorsal horn here. This is the ventral horn. I'm going to put a D for dorsal and a V for ventral horn here. So again, you have this separation, which we talked about earlier in this unit, of somatic sensory and visceral sensory input, where the somatic sensory information is coming from skin and muscle, joints, skeletal muscle and joints, and visceral sensory information that comes from your visceral organs. Similarly, for motor output, you have somatic motor output and visceral motor output. So the motor output, for somatic motor output, that is going towards voluntary tissues. Somatic motor output goes to skeletal muscle tissue. And visceral motor output is the output of the autonomic nervous system, which is going to involuntary tissues, like cardiac muscles, smooth muscle, and glands. Okay, and it's arranged in this in these areas that, yes, on the you do have here up here in this area here you have the sensory information coming in, but they're coming in into separate regions, a somatic sensory part and a visceral sensory part. And similarly for motor output, and in this case, in this area, that's where the cell bodies are for motor neurons, you have visceral motor output and somatic motor output. Okay, so that's the end of Unit 3 on neurophysiology, covering the central nervous system and the parts of the peripheral nervous system that are closely associated with the brain or spinal cord.